where we'll be reviewing potential updates to town bylaws. And Steve, take it away.
Thank you, CR. I'm going to hand it over post haste to our Director of Planning and Economic Development and our Director of Land Use and Community Services. Really briefly, I will just kind of provide an overview from this point forward. So the purpose tonight, there are a number of changes to the zoning bylaw, some of which were proposed last year when one of our October special town meetings had to be canceled due to COVID. So there are some carryover items that were going to be addressed last year and some items that have come up since then. And tonight is an opportunity for the FinCom to get sort of an informal overview so that as we move through the public hearing process with the planning board and the select board and eventually come back to this board, we'll be able to incorporate some of that feedback as staff refines the proposal. So tonight, again, tonight is an informal review with the Finance Committee. Looking ahead, the planning board will continue its hearing on these recommendations on October 12th and potentially finish them that night or else at their following meeting on October 26th. The select board last week voted to close the warrant for the purposes of citizens petitions being proposed at 4 p.m. on October 18th, which is a Monday. And then beyond that, we'll have the select board will either review the warrant on the 19th if the planning board finishes on the 12th, or else on November 2nd if they finish on October 26th. And we'll be aiming to mail out the explanations to select board, finance committee, and town meeting members once the planning board is done. And then we'll be back before this body on November 4th for recommendations that will go to town meeting. We're planning to have an information session for town meeting members. That will also have an overview from the town clerk on re-precincting, which will affect all of our town meeting members on Saturday the 13th at 9 a.m. in this room. And then we're aiming for November 15th for the special town meeting. So that's the timeline. With that, I'll turn it over to Aaron, who can offer some detail, and then I think David will walk us through the PowerPoint.
Yep. Thank you. So appreciate the time. No, we kind of asked to meet with you earlier than normal, again, just because of the volume, and we wanted to kind of suss out substantive comments earlier so that ideally when we see you next, we've got a little bit of the big stuff out of the way and kind of smooth the process out going forward. But one thing, so we've been at this since the very end of August. We've been sharing drafts with various boards and committees that we're working with. And one thing before I hand it over to David, one thing that we've heard so far in the process was kind of what's the thread going through kind of the philosophy behind all of these articles that you're going to review. At a high level, the theme here is to really ensure that the rules governing development in town are as clear, concise, and consistent as possible. That's kind of the overarching goal. Over the last few weeks, we've gotten some feedback that relates to a potential disconnect within the articles themselves. So something like civic space, which seems to discourage development in some instances, with something that seems a bit more pro-development, like the planned development article. For us, the common denominator here is a pivot from development that's kind of more scattered shot, happening in the sparsely developed areas of town, to a more targeted, planned, infrastructure-friendly development within downtown and other specific areas like Endicott Street or Route 1. We think that targeted growth checks more boxes than just new growth, in that we can get more out of development with a more coordinated strategy, and that type of development has fewer externalities associated with it. Some of these will be mixed-use developments anchored by residential uses like those downtown, while other areas that I mentioned, like Endicott Street, would be more commercial, probably more heavily on the commercial side. So an article like site plan review that's in the packet for this town meeting is kind of critical to helping make sure that the companies that are here and growing and exercising our book regularly, that we're regulating that as efficiently as possible. One thing that's not directly addressed in these articles is what staff has been doing and kind of our strategy around economic development. and we're really focusing on biotech and life science sectors. Eastern Massachusetts continues to be globally one of the premier locations to locate in. The North Shore fits into this puzzle as it's a host to a growing healthcare and biomanufacturing cluster. And Danvers in particular is at the crossroads of this area and is uniquely positioned to capture this sort of development. Abiomed, Medtronic, Millipore, all are recently completed or in the process of wrapping up major investments in their sites. And I think if we use this correctly, their presence in town can help us attract more of that. These businesses tend to want to be near their competitors. And I raise this as an example of how planned development could offer landowners in town a chance to think creatively about their future needs while providing the community with the safeguards to check unwanted proposals without wasting staff time, their time and money. So without too much more pontificating, I think, again, the overall intent of what we're trying to discuss with you tonight is how we maintain Danvers as a great place to live, and that the foundation that those properties are built on is as strong as possible so that we can leverage our competitive advantage to the greatest extent possible. And I think with that, David can walk us through a quick slideshow covering each of the articles that we're proposing for town meeting.
All right, thank you very much, gentlemen. Mr. Chair, the way this has worked with the other boards is I ran through the whole presentation, and then at the end we did questions, but I'm happy to take questions piece by piece if that's what you'd rather. So stop me at any point.
If anyone has any pertinent questions, feel free to stop.
Mike, we just got started.
So I'll do a quick run through of the 2020 proposed updates. I know we never officially got to this board last year. I think we did everything but that. So you may have received a lot of material last year at some point. I'm expecting that, you know, you've hung on to that. It's in a binder somewhere. You keep it right by your bed and read it every single night. But in the event that you haven't, I'll go over those. I can be brief or take as much time as we want to do it. And then I'll go through the 2021 updates, and any discussion ensues we can do. So as a reminder for anybody watching at home and for everybody here, last year we were coming to town meeting to change the administrative section, civic space, which Aaron will touch on later, cluster developments, character-based zoning districts, which is the zoning we put in place in February 2020, the site plan review section, definitions, and we had an owner's petition that is once again back this year. It also never made it to town meeting last year. Going forward to 2021, we have dwelling unit conversions with amendments to that, multifamily, inclusionary housing, floodplain overlays, which we don't necessarily have a ton of say over. The federal government pretty much gives you what they would like you to adopt, and you more or less adopt it because there's not really a reason to fight it. But that being said, we can talk about it. Use variances and planned developments, EFLAs or extended family living areas. There's some slight changes to that, but nothing too crazy. Outdoor storage and storage containers. There's two other bylaws that are general bylaws, which I'm not really going to touch on tonight, but just so you're aware. The demolition delay bylaw, which is administered by the Preservation Commission, will be getting an update. Should everything go the way we hope it goes. And then the wetlands protection bylaw. We received some comments back from the Attorney General after it was adopted last year, so we need to incorporate those into the wetlands bylaw. So, starting at administration, this one's pretty simple. There's not a heck of a lot going on. It was really just adding updates to add a severability clause. We don't currently have one in the zoning bylaw. The powers and duties of the planning board. So it spells out the powers and duties of the zoning board of appeals, but for the planning board, it just says more or less shall consist of 5 members. It doesn't actually give them the authority to do anything in the book. So we're giving them the authorities that they currently have and administer, which are special permits and site plan reviews where applicable. We're just actually putting that in the book. It's not spelled out. And then updates to allow for pagination, headings, and typos. So right now, if we need to change a page number or a table heading, we would have to go to town meeting to do that. If we add a clause in to say clearly it's incorrect, can we change that slight Scrivener's error? We would be able to do that going forward. So nothing too wild. Updates to section 4 site plan review. This is a major overhaul of the way this section operates. Right now we have basically 4 different flavors of the way site plan is administered. We're trying to bring that down to 2, so a 4-tiered system down to a 2-tiered system. to allow administrative changes and then public hearings to the planning board as opposed to many iterations between those. We get a lot of calls frequently in my office about, how does somebody know if it's a major modification or a minor modification or an original site plan application, or does it go to staff, does it go to the board, and how does that all work? So we're trying to streamline that, make it clear, and it would be pretty defined as to what exactly is supposed to happen for applicants. The other thing we're doing is moving the table of off-street parking, which is currently only in section 4. So it looks like it really only applies to projects coming in for site plan review, which would then look like we have no parking factors for things that are not in site plan review. We want to just make it pretty clear that there are in fact parking factors everywhere else. So we're pulling that out of site plan and putting it in its own section in the bylaw. For those properties that aren't under or wouldn't fall under site plan review, they at least have a parking factor. Character-based zoning districts cleanup. This really is pretty much a cleanup based on everything that was passed in February. We've since gone through, as you know, it's a very large book. There were typographical errors, some internal references that needed to be corrected, some transposing of parking factors in the table where we wanted to allow things that were closer to municipal lots have less of a parking factor as opposed to more. That's not what it says right now. It's the opposite of what we originally intended. So it's really just a cleanup of some oopsies, I guess you'd rather call them, for lack of a better word, given that it was such a tremendously huge bylaw. There was a few things that got through that were unwanted. Cluster development, section 33. This again is a complete overhaul of the existing bylaw. This is something that it doesn't get used very often. We think the reason for it not getting used as much as it could is financially and geometrically. It's kind of hard to pull off. The bylaw was written when sites were much larger. So the bylaw works fine if you have a 35-acre site you're trying to develop into a subdivision. It doesn't work so great when you have a 6-acre site. As you know from driving around town or being in town for a long time, we don't have many of those very large open green fields left. So if we're going to have it on the books, we're saying we should at least make it work for a developer. Because if not, it's just taking up space in the bylaw. We would recommend either striking it or going forward with the model that we have rather than keeping the existing one on the books. So we think what we laid out works both for the development community and you can actually build it on smaller sites. And then changes to definitions. This was really going through the definition section, seeing if there's any corrections that need to be made. We had noticed there's several duplicate definitions, so we have open space listed 3 times. So if you're trying to figure out how to do open space, it could be one of the 3 different flavors that are listed, which actually are not consistent with each other. So we want to correct that. And other things that are missing, simply like principal use, we don't actually have a definition for that. So we mentioned it several times in the zoning bylaw, but if you were to look what is a principal use on a site, or an accessory use for that matter, we don't define it, so we're going to add that in. And then this brings us to the 2021 updates. So these, what we've been telling boards, committees, or anyone who will listen, generally fall into 3 different buckets. So they're things that are state legislative changes or case law updates, chronic problems or nuisance issues that we hear either from abutters or people on boards or the business community, and then requests, technical corrections, and consistency items. So the first one is storage containers. Right now on residential lots, you can have up to 2 storage containers 2 times per year for as long as you want. We do get an awful lot of calls about storage containers, about people in their neighborhood saying, this guy next to me has had a storage container here for 3 years. When is he going to move it? How long can he have it there? What's going on with that? And what are you going to do about it? And unfortunately, our answer generally is you can do that. It's not a zoning violation. There's not much we can do about it. So we're not proposing to eliminate the allowance of them. We just want to impose some time limits, which we think are fairly reasonable. So for 60 days, you could have a storage container on your lot, do whatever you want to do with it, move things inside of it and out of it. After 60 days, between 60 days and 180 days, we'd consider it an accessory structure, which really means it just has to meet setbacks, so you wouldn't be able to just kind of dump it on your front lawn and leave it there for a while. You can still have it, it just would need to meet the setbacks for the lot. And then after 180 days, it would be a special permit to the Zoning Board of Appeals. Again, doesn't mean you can't have one, it would just require some further review. And within that, there are some performance standards you'd have to meet, so it couldn't simply be a school bus that you took the wheels off of and are filling with stuff. It would need to be an actual container, designed to be a container from a company like a Pod or a Pack Rat or a U-Haul or something like that. In the commercial and industrial side, we're just going with a 180-day breakpoint, so you can have storage containers up to 180 days by right. After that, special permit to the Zoning Board of Appeals, and those are pretty much the only restrictions for commercial or industrial sites. For
David, I just want to ask,
Yep.
Do we have any data on, most people, I would assume, or many people who are putting a temporary storage container on their property are doing it probably for a construction project?
Yep.
Do we have any data on what the average length of a construction project is? And if 60 days is not sufficient, I mean, I'm thinking about, I'm doing work to my house now, and I'm certainly in more the 90-day window.
Yeah.
And if I didn't have a spare bedroom, I would need a storage container.
Certainly, yeah.
Is 60 days really a practical number, especially if you're in the middle of construction? Setbacks are probably the least of your concerns.
Right.
I guess is 60 days, where did we get 60 days from?
That's an excellent question. In terms of the length of construction projects, it depends if you're talking about the before times or now, as you know.
Yeah.
So you can't get anything nowadays, so it's
Right.
going to take way longer. That being said, there's a carve-out in this bylaw to allow for construction projects. So it says as long as you have a building permit in good standing, we're not going to, it's unrestricted. You can have that storage container for specific reasons like that. Say you have a fire, or you're doing a major addition, or you're taking the roof off. Clearly, you need somewhere to put your stuff. So as long as you're okay with the building commissioner and everything's up on the up and up, you're good to go.
Thank you.
Can you leave a permit open somewhat indefinitely?
A building permit? No, you need to re-up, I believe, every 6 months. So it's not unlimited, but that's why we say in good standing. So it's not just hang the jacket in the window and call it done. You need to actually be progressing along with the project. So outdoor storage, displays, and sales. Right now, the current book reads exactly like you see. We categorize everything. It's just outdoor storage, display, sales. It's all one thing, and there's one standard for all of those types. Right now, it's 20% of the existing floor area of the space that you're using, which is somewhat complicated. I mean, it gets you to a quick number, but that's clearly different from Danvers Hardware downtown to the Costco out on Route 1. The floor areas are vastly different. The sites are vastly different. So the 20% might not be the best rule for everybody, we were thinking. So we're trying to categorize it as outdoor storage being true outdoor storage, which is more or less like what you see on the screen. Customers are not going to go to this PVC pipe storage area. It'll be employees only. They may be using a forklift, and this is long-term storage of materials that are waiting to be sold or waiting to go to a job site. As opposed to outdoor displays, which are things like heavier equipment that a customer does not walk in generally, purchase that snowblower. They would say, I'd like to purchase a snowblower. When they go inside, somebody will go get it from somewhere else. This is really truly a display to show you merchandise or something that's on offer. So we'd like that as a second category. And a separate third category, which was true outdoor sales. Like you're walking by, you grab a rake or a shovel or a potted plant, and a customer actually goes and purchases those things. So what we're trying to do is on your site plan or whatever plan set you have to submit, you have to show those distinct areas. We're not disallowing any of those things. It just makes it significantly easier if we ever have to go down there and say, what's actually happening on this site? It's, you have PVC pipes here, rakes over there, potted plants everywhere, there's a random snow blower, and we have no idea what's going on. If we look at our definition, it's all just considered one thing. So for the big box stores in particular, but anywhere that really sells a multitude of items, it'll make it significantly easier, either for enforcement issues or even just determining what it is that they're doing on the site for both the customers and for staff. So the next items are dwelling unit conversions and multifamilies. So both of these things, well, dwelling unit conversions specifically are allowed in the single-family zones that we currently have, R1, R2, and R3. Our proposal is, it's very broad in scope, so we'd like to come out with a broad scope, and we can walk it back if we need to. So dwelling unit conversions, we're proposing to eliminate those from the zoning bylaw altogether, with the rationale being that we're calling the R1, R2, and R3 our single-family zoning districts, but then allowing multifamilies by right in those zoning districts. So this kind of falls into the nuisance bucket for staff, and that we do get a lot of phone calls for these things, particularly in what folks describe as older established single-family neighborhoods. Someone will call and say, there's something going on next door, they're putting in 3 additional units, there's a large parking field with a whole bunch of stormwater infrastructure going in. Like, what's happening? I thought I lived in a single-family neighborhood. And again, we have to respond to them. That's actually allowed by right, and that project's good to go. And we hope to work with you in the future, but there's not a heck of a lot we can do about that currently. And then multifamily, we brought this up to the Zoning Board of Appeals, both of these items actually, discussed it at length. So multifamily structures are allowed in the R1 district by right. Again, you have to have a certain lot size, a certain amount of land, and there's a limited number of units you can do on those sites depending on the size of the lot. The Zoning Board of Appeals has since said we don't want to eliminate that entirely, which is what we were proposing. We'd like to leave 2 families allowable by right in R1, but eliminate the multifamily component of that. So that's where the ZBA stands. The planning board hasn't taken a position, but happy to hear what you all think.
Can you repeat? So, so you're allowing multifamily in R1, but not R2 and R3?
It is allowed now, just in R1. It's not multifamily, not dwelling conversions. They are actually 2 separate things in our zoning bylaw. But multifamilies are not allowed in R2 and R3 currently. It's only in R1.
Can you explain the difference between the two?
So a multifamily, it could be a new build or a new structure or a completely separate structure. For instance, if you have a single-family home at the front of the lot and you happen to have a very large lot, you can put 2 or 3 or however many units you're allowed in the back throughout the site. A dwelling conversion generally happens within the existing structure. So if you had a large old Victorian, which I believe what the bylaw was designed to do, but it doesn't specify that, you could allow multiple units to be developed inside the existing shell. But there are no restrictions on that. There's no design standards. So often, you could, in theory, come in and put a very large addition on year 1, and then year 2 come back and say, I'm going to chop this up for condos. Not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing. It seems like the way it's written, it wasn't necessarily intended for that, but there's not very many parameters to that section of the bylaw.
I thought there was a year situation when you were dealing with conversion, so so that you weren't able to. So if I couldn't go in and put a 15,000 square foot addition on a and then come back and say, oh, by the way, now I want to be able to put 5 units, because I thought there was a year limitation on that.
I'd have to double check that, but I don't know if we count the new portion of the structure as being new if the existing structure was very old. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like if the card
yeah.
says 1915,
Yeah.
it is what it is. It's kind of a thing, but.
In terms of the conversions, just again, I apologize because I don't have the book in front of me right now, but when we're dealing with dwelling unit conversions, there are lot size limitations in regards to that. So it's not as if you would be able to take a 10,000 square foot lot, which would be the standard size for residence 1, and be able to convert that single unit into 4 units. I think you needed 15,000 square feet, right, to be able to do anything with it.
That's actually the other one. That's the multifamily one that you're thinking of?
Yeah.
Which, again, that one does.
See, I thought there were also limitations on the dwelling unit conversion.
There are limitations. They are a lot lower. It's 2,500 square feet of lot area
per unit. That's right, too.
The multifamily is the other one that
He needed to be at 15,000 to be able to put 2 in.
Yep,
And
exactly.
and so basically what you're saying is that we're still going to have the 15,000 limitation.
Yep.
But you're not going to be able. There were additional. You could put 3 or 4 units as well in residence 1
Right.
if you had a larger lot.
Yes.
Arguably. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah, so we'd still, full bore going forward with keeping the 2 families, potentially walking back the multifamily limitation. I will say the dwelling unit conversion one, the zoning board, after kicking it around a little bit, also would like to just walk that back. We're recommending at this time, we initially said, well, if you want to do anything, it's not necessarily written super well, so we could probably tweak it, but we didn't have time for that this year, so we just kind of said, if you're going to keep it, then keep it. If you're going to do anything, just remove it. They've since come out and said they don't want to remove that from the bylaw. We still have yet to hear from the other boards, but we'll see where that one goes. Yep.
So the goal with that stuff is to clear up clerical inconsistencies, to incentivize, make development, multi-unit development easier. What's the motivating factor for that stuff?
This one in particular, the dwelling unit conversions, I had said we broke them out into several buckets on the things we get phone calls about. So that was one of the nuisance ones. But to Aaron's point earlier about the overall philosophy, this contributes quite a bit to a lot of the scattershot development that we've been seeing across town, which again, there's nothing wrong with it, but we've done a lot of it over the years, which has significantly contributed to the denominator for the SHI. So it's something we're constantly watching. So in the back.
What's
in-
SHI?
Subsidized housing inventory, sorry. So we need to maintain 10% of our housing stock affordable on the subsidized housing inventory, or we're eligible for 40Bs or
No,
comprehensive
yeah, I
permits.
understand that part.
Yeah.
David, do
So-
you have the ability to pull up the map that you showed? I'm sorry to put you on the spot.
No, I cut the map from this
So,
PowerPoint.
so you're
Steve.
saying while it may
this
be
is your-
scattershot, it's also helping us meet subsidized housing thresholds,
Yeah.
affordable
It's-
housing thresholds?
It's actually not.
Hurting it because
Hurting it.
we have too many housing units and therefore we can't get to the 10% because of
We
the,
don't have too many housing units.
If I did that.
We don't have enough
do the
housing units,
9.7,
but the map
is it
does
the
a nice
9.7?
job of
Yeah.
displaying how this development occurs, which is literally,
No, not DSP.
as David said,
planning
take
boards.
a shotgun and shoot
Yeah.
the map of Danvers, and you'll see them sprayed all over the town.
Yep.
And all of those, by onesies and twosies, work against our ability to stay at the 10% threshold,
course,
because
yeah.
they all fall under any requirement for offset. Sorry to do this to you guys.
You said they do all fall, yeah.
They all work against it.
Which is also unfortunate, because in many cases, those are affordable units that are being put into those houses, they just don't count.
Right, because they have to have a formal
And what
restriction.
Aaron was saying
Right.
earlier is some of the recent zoning and some of the overarching zoning changes are designed to direct development to where the existing infrastructure, parking, utilities are, so that we're not seeing what you see on the map, which is housing units proliferate across
So
established.
what's highlighted in red here, this is the parcel map. The beige color is R1, R2, R3. White is not R1, R2, R3. Green is some of the town-owned land or other kind of open space land, but the red is where properties that have taken advantage of those. And again, the number here, by this count, is 798. So we've had, over the years, and again, it's not to say that any one of these projects is bad, it's just when we're trying to coordinate and understand development patterns and the potential build-out and impact of growth and development, it's just happening everywhere. So again, like in my neighborhood, it's, oh, we've only had one of these happen near me, but in totality, it ends up being quite a bit. And so I think this article was kind of spurred by the recognition of the Zoning Board of Appeals and staff dealing with a lot of these externalities that are associated with this, that should we take a look at this and make sure that this is still properly calibrated to what we want?
So, excuse me, just to make sure I understand, the red are conversions of property from single unit to multi-unit? That's what the red shows?
Yeah, those are parcels that in some way, shape, or form are zoned single-family today, but do have more than one unit on them. So they've taken advantage of one of those two sections of the bylaw.
Would EFLAs be included in this? No, so
EFLAs are
this is
not included.
that's-
yeah, because it's weird that you say that, because I'm looking at like the areas in the northern end. I'm wondering how are those places more than, I mean, some of those are in, like, I think it's one of them's on my street. We're single family, 25.
Yeah,
I don't know who on my street has a two-family.
right.
Something to do tonight. What's that, I'm just curious what that very large parcel is, kind of off of, kind of to the right of 95?
Yep,
Whoop, whoop,
that
whoop.
that is actually somebody's, or more than one person's home.
Oh, okay.
Yep. It is a very large.
It's just a large parcel, single family?
I believe that's on Spring Street
Oh,
to the bottom.
Okay, I know
It
exactly
is-
where it is,
yeah.
yep.
It is
okay.
quite wet. I believe there's a pond back
There
there.
is,
so-
yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So,
So that, all of that being said, to one of the things I was stressing to the other boards as well to keep in mind, so given that map, those existing units are going to remain. No one's going to bulldoze a 4-unit development to put a single-family home. So something to keep in mind, that those developments will be there more than likely for quite some time, if not forever, in their existing form. And they're allowed to do so. They can do maintenance. They can keep living their lives and do whatever they want. So we have a robust housing stock for those units that may be smaller. This was just an attempt to say, as Aaron pointed out, maybe going forward in the future, we want to limit some of that scattershot development and bring it closer to where we have the infrastructure, or where we have existing planning and zoning in place that we've allowed for that, like similar to what we've done downtown recently. So there's that one, or two, really. Moving forward to EFLAs, we are not proposing, as I said, much to this bylaw. There'd still be a cap of 25 per year allowed. It would still be blood relation based on probate court rules. The only thing we're really doing is changing how to measure it. So we have a new building commissioner in between he and I after looking at it. There's quite a bit where you're getting plans and you're kind of really making a gut call on like, does this meet the 750 square foot limit? If it includes, some habitable space under the building code, but it's not finished space, and it's difficult to make that call. So we're really just spelling out what exactly is measured for the EFLA, what portions of it are measured, and things that count or don't count towards the EFLA. A few design tweaks in that I added in, all stairwells need to be interior to the structure. You can't have an excess stairwell outside, because one of the things the zoning board at least looks for is they don't want the families looking like a two-family structure if you're simply adding an EFLA. So we said, well, if that's the case, we should change the design of it a little bit. The doors still can't be facing the road, so it doesn't look like two doors are facing the street. Stairwells have to be inside, no exterior bulkheads coming out of the EFLA. So not a lot going on, really. It's just some small tweaks to help us actually administer it.
Is there any thought of increasing that to above 750 square feet?
There,
Because a lot of them that come in front of the Board of Appeals go over that.
They do ask for more than that. We don't currently count common space or common area in the 750 square feet. So oftentimes when you look at it, the living area for the family living in the EFLA is larger than 750 because they're probably sharing either a laundry room or a
Some
kitchen.
used for handicapped people also.
Right, right. It's something we could certainly take a look at. We weren't proposing to change that number this year, but if the community feels differently, we can definitely take a look at that.
They rarely go over 1,000. I want to say that what we're seeing at
We,
the ZBA is
I think we had
1,000.
one this year that asked for slightly less than 1,200, but it was for medical equipment.
Yeah.
So the person moving in needed very specific medical equipment for whatever they were being treated for. So they were accommodated, but.
How do you define an EFLA within a home?
When it's just, there's no addition, it's just completely within the structure, you mean? So those are allowed by right by the building commissioner now. Those do happen actually more often than you'd think, because generally the construction required isn't typically onerous if it's more or less an interior fit out of the space. So those are allowed. They don't need to go to the zoning board of appeals. They can happen by right.
You talked about unfinished but livable space.
Right.
Can you give me an example of what unfinished but livable? I have a pretty good grasp of, I think,
So there's
livable but unfinished. But
yeah, there's habitable space. So there's portions of buildings like half stories and attics, basements if the ceilings are above a certain height, or bathrooms if the ceiling is sloped and above a certain height, that can be habitable, meaning they meet everything required to be habitable, but for the fact that you didn't hang drywall and you didn't do plumbing or electrical. So a lot of the times, those are. I don't want to say anyone's doing it on a nefarious point of view, but when you look at it, it's like, well, there's a stairway up to it. It meets all the parameters, but you didn't put some sheetrock up. So I'm not a wizard, but I think we can see what's going to happen after you get the CO,
Yep.
kind of a thing.
Thank you.
So that's where that was coming from. The next item we want to talk about, or I will talk about, is plan developments. This one, we can talk as long as you'd want about it. It's a little bit more to get your head around than some of the other articles. So this article, if it goes forward, would introduce the concept of plan developments and then remove the ability for use variances. In 1975 or 76, the state legislature came forward and said, anyone currently doing use variances, you can continue to do those, but nobody can propose that going forward. So essentially, they grandfathered in communities that were doing them, still wanted to do them, and then took those powers away if they didn't currently exist. So I did a little snooping. I'm sure there's more communities out there than I was able to find, but I looked at about 100 different communities, and the list on the left were the only ones I could find that were doing use variances per their zoning bylaw. The list on the right are communities that were doing what we call a planned development type schema, so they allow for this type of development. And so planned developments, in a nutshell, is if you're familiar with what a traditional PUD approach is, or a planned unit development, it's a development type that goes outside of the rigid structures of traditional zoning and allows for flexibility brought forward by an applicant. So if you have a large, generally used for larger sites, we're not currently proposing a site limit, but generally if you had a larger site, if you have a business plan, you know what you want to do, but some of the uses or all of the uses aren't allowed in the zone that you're located in, you'd be allowed to propose what we're calling a planned development. So you'd essentially an applicant would write the zoning for the district to say, like, here's my 7 or 10-year business model. I'm going to actually think about what I want to do. It's going to be planned out so the community can expect what's going to happen. And there'll be some concept plans around that. They're not traditionally super rigid, but folks are going to want to see, well, you're proposing 4-story height limit. What's that going to look like? So we'd like to see, in a boxy kind of drawing, like how big is it going to be and how is it going to work? But for the most part, it focuses on uses allowed or not allowed and the dimensional variables within those. So it does allow for flexibility in the design on the applicant's side. Currently, the way it would work is if you do need to change the use, you can either go to town meeting and actually change the zoning or write your own zoning, which is still allowable and will be allowable going forward. Or you ask for a variance. You may need a special permit from either the zoning board or the planning board. Likely you have to go to site plan review, likely you'll have to go to the Conservation Commission, and if you have a historic structure on your property, you got to go to those boards as well. So the end result is to say Aaron and I have been working with a number of developers recently where they've been more or less in the wash cycle between these boards that are traditionally rigidly siloed on purpose by state law. Between 18 and 24 months in some cases, 24 months being more of the norm for the larger ones. And at the end result, they come out of the whole process without a permit and with no project. So what we're proposing is, if planned developments were allowed, it would be a finite window where you apply, you have a definitive end date, and you get feedback early on in the process from all of these boards to give you a steering direction on where to go. If it's thumbs up or thumbs down, if you're completely off base, at least you'll know that from the get-go. You don't have to spend, as an applicant, several tens of thousands of dollars just to get engineering plans and architectural plans and everything you're going to need to go forward.
Question on that. Were you, is this kind of an override of the current existing zoning bylaws that have been approved and voted on by the town meeting?
So what it...
Because that's what it sounds like to me. It almost sounds like a spot zoning issue.
So all of the proposals will actually need to be voted on by town meeting, so it's very, very similar statutorily to a traditional rezoning process. So it still follows under Mass General Law, Section 5, the rezoning process one would have to go through. If an owner just came forward and said, I'd like to change my zone, please, what say you, town meeting?
So this really just puts a front-end process on what's described in 40A Section 5. And again, as David said, it's really to try to give a little bit of a heads up before they sink a ton of money into it, to get an idea of, like, is the community going to be receptive to this idea? So it's not a usurpation of anything. This is actually, in fact, in a way, I'm going to use a dangerous term, it's almost like we're giving the special permit authority to town meeting. So they're going to come, what we're proposing here is a process, and what they'll go to town meeting to kind of get that blessing. So again, we don't think it's any sort of
But if
removal.
if it did happen to pass at town meeting, that means some commercial thing that might only be a half an acre or an acre could plop right into a residential area?
So currently, we're not proposing any limitations, with the reasoning being that there's almost organic safeguards in that it's highly unlikely that a neighborhood that's represented at town meeting would want that to happen. And the point being that with all the boards and committees that this will be vetted by ahead of time, the applicant will likely know that well before they ever get to the floor.
And I think just to address the legality point of spot zoning, as David mentioned, planned development in its various flavors has been extremely vetted throughout the Commonwealth. And so again, we don't feel there's any concerns about spot zoning on that. And again, there's ample case law around that. And again, having this go through the town meeting process kind of cleans that of it. And, nothing happens without town meeting's blessing here.
Can you think of a good example of a property where this might, not to do
Sure.
development for the development community, but like the Denny site came to mind. I don't know if you can think of a good site that would help. sort of
I'll pick
illustrate
on,
this.
well, the mall.
Aaron's going to say the mall. I'll throw out there, we've seen a lot of activity recently at what's the BJ's site, if everyone knows where BJ's is. So it's kind of a small campus. He's got a huge parcel. It's 25, 30 acres, and there's a lot of different little things going on in there. But they kind of happen over time, and each one of those generally has to go through some sort of process, if not the whole process I just walked you through with every board. So what this would allow the property owner to do is sit down and say, what do I want this campus type thing that I own to be? So if it is focused in, say, flex fabrication and manufacturing, they can gear themselves towards that and market the site that way, as opposed to being limited to what's allowable in that zone today.
And they don't necessarily build it all out of the gate, right? They're gonna say, we're looking for, I'll pick on the mall, that parking lot in front is no longer necessary for the mall itself. We'd like to put an R&D facility there or some Class A office space, but we're not gonna necessarily build that until we have the demand, until there's a demand for it. But at least, as David said, they've sat down and thought about the next business cycle or two, and then come to town meeting and said, we'd like the right to do this going forward, but again, it may take 7 to 10 years for us to realize that development potential. So again, it's a little bit more deliberate on their part. And again, I think as we reach kind of a build out of the community, it's going to get harder and harder for property owners, especially larger sites, to kind of live within the box that they have today. Our zoning is fairly constrained, and this, I think, allows them a little bit of creativity to think ahead and a mechanism, a process to approach us to say, hey, is this idea crazy or not?
By the same token, they shouldn't try to come in front of a board when they're just in the process of developing and expect 10 or 12 variances to set them up to get going.
That's why this is kind of paired with the conversation around the use variance, because right now, and again, I don't want to say it's a bad thing, but right now you have property owners relying on variances as part of the permitting process. That is the way I need to get this project done. This would eliminate that because they don't, well, unless they're so short-sighted that they write themselves into a zoning that they quickly realize they can't live with. But in this case, it would mean that property owner has to think ahead, what do we want our build-out to look like? And then they draft the zoning to ensure that they don't need special relief to realize that vision. And again, that's all vetted up front, ultimately blessed or not by town meeting.
That sounds better. Thank you.
And I think not that the state gets it right in every case, but I think there was a reason that the state X decades ago put its foot down and prohibited the use of these use variances in communities that weren't already using them. And as David alluded to, I think after looking at a third of the communities in Massachusetts, he came up with 5 that still allow these. And they're not, this is not a knock on the ZBA, but they are not great tools for, pass, fail in terms of development projects. And this allows for bigger picture thinking that has to be approved by town meeting in order to move forward at all. But it offers some upfront assurances and guidance to these projects so that they're not constantly going through 12 pages of permitting.
So I'm gonna need to get my really around this, I think. So
Yep.
First and foremost, I agree. Use variances are ridiculous. They just simply don't make any sense in terms of what a variance is supposed to be. Frankly, it's impossible to actually meet the quote-unquote standard that you're supposed to meet for a variance in terms of the uniqueness of the property and all those different types of things. And there's no hardship other than an economic hardship, which is not a hardship. So I think certainly from that standpoint, it makes perfect sense for us to do away with use variances in Danvers. We probably should have done it 20 years ago. The problem is that there's been pushback within the development community for that, because this has been the mechanism that they have used to avoid what was 25 or 30 years of, in essence, using zoning to stop development, not to work with development and to try to, so I understand that. So from this standpoint, I think the idea of getting rid of use variances in Danvers makes perfect sense. I can assure you that I can't support any type of, you can't do a use variance in residential zones right now.
Correct.
And so something that is intended as sort of the replacement for use variances, I wouldn't be able to support that within the residential zone. So I would not be able to support the ability for a developer to come in and ask for a planned unit development within a residential zone, basically, as because they can't do that now. So that's number one. In regards to the process that brings town meeting involved with it, I don't understand how any developer would ever in a million years think that they're gonna be able to go to the Danvers town meeting and get approval for almost anything, or quite honestly.
And it would be a 2/3 vote.
2/3 vote for it, I guess. I don't, so if we really want to make something that's going to work, I'm not sure that having the town meeting component, even though I know there's going to be a lot of people who that's going to be necessary for them to be willing to go along with anything on this, it's a political tightrope that is going to be almost impossible to walk in this particular situation. So I just, from a, we're here to discuss this. I just think that the idea that almost anything is going to be able to get through a 2/3 vote at town meeting of any significance is pretty unlikely, at least at this particular point.
Well, I don't know, I mean, I'm not catching all the nuance, but let's say a property, big malls are losing their luster. And let's say somebody that the owner of a big mall was coming in to say, you know what, I want to take this property and have some office space in it and some R&D, maybe some manufacturing, but I also want to have a housing component, and right now it's not allowed there. So what I'm thinking of is a plan that will have some housing in an area of restaurants and parks and outside area and still some shops and so the creative way to solve these vast areas that currently are shopping malls, I could see town meeting would think that was a great way, because as the town manager has mentioned, we don't have enough housing. And if this is a way to bring some ideas for additional housing in areas that it's not yet allowed, I could see town meeting being pretty intrigued by such an idea.
Like you brought up Denny's, I think if somebody said, hey, this is a project we have in mind for this whole parcel, pretty much anybody in town meeting is driven by that eyesore at this point. That versus a beautiful, people are going to be much more receptive to something there. I'm curious, how is it executed in other towns that have this? Is it through town meeting in those towns?
So, yeah, I get where you're at on the town meeting side of it, that's the hardest thing for, I think, most folks to wrap their head around, and how is that going to work? Unfortunately, because we would be changing the use, it's a rezone in effect. So you do, state law says we have to go to town meeting. There's no other way out of that or around that. Not that we would be proposing that anyway, but if there were, there isn't, so.
And I think, Mike, you probably know this, but just to make sure it's abundantly clear, those property owners always have the right to ask us for the rezone.
Exactly.
So again,
Yeah.
there's nothing stopping the 20,000 square foot residential property owner from coming to us and saying, I want to build Rosewood Part 2 on this parcel. I think what we're trying to contemplate here is signal, that law was written, I think, or last amended in 1975-ish vintage. So again, we're trying to add a little bit of signal that locally we're not adverse to hearing about these proposals and trying to make that process work a little bit better for both parties. Because again, under the existing statute, it's really a gamble to go to town meeting, because you just show up at the planning board meeting and you're in the system and hoping for the best. At least here, what we've done is put some front end on that to say, you can meet with the Board of Selectmen, you can meet with the planning board, you can meet with the zoning board and any other board that might happen to have jurisdiction on your site, and at least tell us what you're thinking, and we can kind of give you hot or cold, and that way you haven't invested heavily into that, to find out. And again, that, it's a no-go. And then vice versa, we've talked about the current model, and Denny's is a prime example. We spent 24 months with them that did need a variance because they wanted to introduce residential into the mix down there, and that was ultimately turned down, followed by about 3 weeks later, Hollywood Hits, same fate. They wanted a use variance to introduce residential down there, and that was a no-go. And I'll just harken back to my kind of opening comments, which is, I think if we don't, as a community, start talking about our commercial areas like the mall that seem to be probably firing on not all cylinders at the moment, and the retail environment is completely changed. It was changing anyway. The pandemic has completely accelerated those trends. The market will want to do housing everywhere. I mean, that is the easiest thing to do right now, is to say you need housing. And I think what this process is trying to telegraph, and what we're trying to work on in those areas that are currently commercial zoned, is we know that, but what else can we do? Because we don't want to give it all away, because again, we want to try to maintain the balance of the tax base between residential and commercial and industrial. And I think planned unit development gives some of those properties, again, not all, but many of these properties, a kind of an easier way to think ahead. And maybe we can safeguard it from just coming in and saying, we just want to be residential. We just want to be residential, because that's...
Yeah, we know that already. Yeah, that's the easy one.
Yeah, I mean, and here's the issue with saying that. I'm not sure how just as an example, I mean, I think we all look at the Linfield, whatever that is, what they call it, which is a mix of a bunch of stuff. But I think that's a much bigger parcel than what we have at the mall, for example, isn't it?
It did include the golf course, so
It might be bigger, but
I think they used a planned development model there, though. I think that was a PUD.
But yeah, I mean, I'm wondering how to legitimately to be able to do what I think we would want to see there, which is a true mixed use, as opposed to predominantly residential with just enough other stuff so
Right.
you can get your residential.
right.
I'm going to sound really old here right now, but I've never been a big, one of the biggest mistakes we made in this town was what we did with the state hospital in regards to the fact that that's basically all residential up top there. And, we've gone over the course of the last 15 years from a community that was about 23,000 people to a community that's about 28,000 people right now. I'm not sure that there's a tremendous desire to get to 30, 31, 32,000 people in this town. And so when you say, can we get, I don't think you're gonna get residential stuff like that through town meeting. Because I think there'll always be enough
Right, but I'm saying
old-timers
that's
down
what,
there.
I think writ large.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, Aaron's earlier opening statement, I think the push will be for residential because they're easy to
Yeah.
sell. But to be honest with you, I think the tool that we were envisioning more is to set this up to allow for a mix of uses of the commercial variety,
Yeah.
particularly if we're targeting life science and biomanufacturing. Because I know, speaking with the businesses up on Cherry Hill, a lot of them would like to expand, but they're at their limit on those sites. So they're
Yeah.
looking to us to say, we'd love to stay in Danvers. Where are we going to do that? So they, if they're spinning off, they may be leaving town, and this could be a mechanism to help hold on to those expansions.
And I also,
If I can jump, the purpose of this is not to accelerate residential development.
No, I understand that.
And I
No.
think using Denny's as a good example, because it's a real-world example, if the alternatives that we're faced with today are wait for another developer to propose 150 housing units and go through the ZBA, or put a process on the table that allows for more creativity in talking, there's going to be a residential component. The market has telegraphed that to us. If we can avoid it being 100% residential by having a process by which they can show us alternatives to that, maybe it's 60 units plus something rather than 150 units of straight mixed-use housing.
I also think people at town meeting, I mean, maybe I speak for myself, but to me, there's a difference between greenfield plan use and zoning variances and like big concrete brownfield that's outlived its useful, commercial relevance. What are we gonna do
Calling
now?
those gray fields.
Yeah, well, yeah, there's no trees left. It's all asphalt. Like, what are we gonna do? Like, mentally, I approach those two scenarios very differently from each other, and I would think other people would as well.
Yeah, again, it may be a dramatic change from what the typical mentality has been, and I think Mike can agree with me on this, is that when you come to these types of situations, there is definitely a core group of people in this town that would look at it and go, tough luck. It's something, if you ask me, and I'm not saying this for me personally, but if the crappy Denny site as opposed to 150 residential unit apartment complex, I'd rather have the crappy Denny site. It's not being used for anything. It's not adding any traffic. It's not putting any kids in the school. It's not using any water. I still think there's probably a core group of people in town who look at it that way.
I will make a note, you're the first resident to call the town hall and say that you like the crappy thing you said.
No, but I mean, yeah, but
I totally appreciate what you're saying about granting people but that kind of ties back to the scale of residential development and how they're doing it. Like, 150 units is 400 people, 300, 400 people. No, I totally know what you mean.
But for context again, I think the recent census has Danvers at 28,000 people. That's maybe 4% higher than it was a decade ago. So when we talk about growth here, that's not really growth. I mean, to put that in the context of what's happened in a lot of places. I mean, Eastern Massachusetts is not growth. I mean, that's not. If you divide that out, that's 0.25% a year, 0.5% a year.
Yeah.
So, but I think it is good to hear all of these thoughts, because we're going to hear them, from everybody going forward, so I appreciate that.
What's the status of the buildings on Locust Street and the one downtown, right next to the Suburban? Have any of those been rented yet or anything, those apartments?
20 Locust Street, the residential component, I don't know if it's fully leased out, but it's substantially leased out. I believe they now actually have a commercial tenant as well. I don't know if he has any other tenants in those. I think it's 4 spaces on the first floor. The other one in the center of town, the taller green one, I don't think he has a certificate of occupancy yet, so they can't lease yet.
I was going to ask.
Although he might have just got that.
It'll jump in my mind 10 minutes from now.
But again, I think, Mike, to your point about build out, I think, again, I think right now the zoning bylaw kind of anticipates, I'm going to say, was it like about 1,000? When we did our build out analysis a couple years ago.
Yes.
I mean, right now you're probably going to get about 1,000 new units happening elsewhere, anywhere through the R1, R2, and R3. And what we're trying to do is, again, kind of recalibrate that a little bit to focus that more. And those will be largely single-family detached, of which we already have 7,000 of those. And one thing we heard a lot through the 40R process in 2017, and then again with the downtown zoning specifically in 2020, was I'm a baby boomer, I would like something else to offer. And so we are trying to basically make that pivot to say, rather than take those 1,000 that are already serving a very well-served market, what we don't have is the ability to find a small 1 or 2 bedroom unit downtown that checks, again, more boxes. Like, we didn't need a new street to create that unit. Its size alone will limit some of the other issues that come along and expenses that come along with larger units. And again, we start putting people on top of the businesses, so we've got a built-in economic development strategy because we're putting more people down there. So again, it's just trying to, rather than create a community of 35,000, we think we know where the number is, but let's move that number and try to be smarter about where those next 1,000 units come. And can those units help us achieve our other goals? And that again is why I think planned unit development, again, thinking creatively as these zones start to become built out, Cherry Hill, Electronics Ave, 114 is pretty much built out now. Where are those opportunities for new growth going to come? And you guys know as the finance committee, we need the new growth. We're going to need that somewhere, or the community's going to have to find other methods of raising revenue, and I don't think that's in the makings in the near term.
So I
Oh,
think.
I remember my question. So I'm trying to understand what you're talking about with variance. So if somebody had a lot that was slightly too small to put 3 townhouses on right now, in a place where they otherwise could be able to do so, you're saying there is no longer a path for them to just get some variance from the zoning board, and they would have to go this route?
No, you'd still be able to ask for a traditional variance, which is like a dimensional variance. So if your lot was too small, or it's funky shaped, or something like that, that's not being touched at all. You can still do that. Anyone can do that. You know, everything from the guy who needs a little bit more space to put 2 steps on his front porch, all the way up to a huge commercial site that's trying to make it fit. So you'd still be able to do those. It's just limiting the use ask. So like what?
Okay, so for change of,
So right now,
so for change of use within a zone, but
Right,
you
so
can
let's
get a
say-
variance on
If-
geographical stuff within a zoning
if I'm in
use.
highway corridor
Yeah.
and we don't allow fast food in highway corridor, like it's in the book, says fast food, and it says, no, it is not allowed. I can go to the zoning board of appeals and say, for me, I want that to be allowed. May I have this use? That's what the state law has kind of said. We shouldn't be allowing communities to do that. And something, again, that Danvers is finding itself in a very small minority of communities that still allow that.
How common have use variances been, say, in the last 5 years? And can you cite just some examples in town of use variances that have been passed, just for the
20
edification?
Locust Street, 44 Maple Street, the 2 properties we just talked
Oh, that's right,
about
yeah.
were unlocked by a use variance.
Yeah.
Well, were they, but I guess my question is it, so there's 2 sort of components to the use variance part of it. One is that it's a prior use variance in which they then come to you for a finding afterwards. Was that the situation with those where they had, so these went to the ZBA requesting new use variances, but in both cases, I guess the most common situation is that we have zones that do not allow residential uses, and so they come in a non-residential use zone asking for a residence.
And you've hit on something very key that our book allows now and would still allow going forward. If you are non-conforming, we allow you through a finding to do a substitution of a non-conforming use.
Yeah.
So you can do that all day, you'll still be able to do that. The difference is, if you had received a variance for that
Yeah,
use,
you
you're
can't-
no longer
yeah.
non-conforming, you're
Okay.
conforming, because you got a variance for it. So
Yeah.
that would go away, but for any business or any property owner who is non-conforming based on their use, they could swap out to any other use in the bylaw just through a finding.
I think, and again, I understand this, and it's not something that I personally am completely opposed to. I mean, I have concerns about some components of it.
Sure.
I just think that one of the questions that will be asked, for example, in the Endicott area, where we've got the mall and other underutilized parcels, let's say, the question, I think, which is sort of reasonable, is going to be, okay, I understand what you're talking about this. Why don't we just go in and do we spent a lot of time and a lot of effort doing some very, very good work downtown to develop a new zoning scheme for downtown. So why don't we do the same thing for the Endicott area? And then the other, on the flip side of that coin is, we just spent quite a bit of time and effort to try to do something downtown. Why would we let these people now come before us and ask for these new planned unit development types of situations?
Sure,
So-
yeah, no, point very well taken. I don't think I have a direct answer for that right
Yeah,
now.
I think, but I think you're going to need one.
Yeah,
I think
yeah, yeah. I hear you.
is the point with it. So
The other thing too, I snatched some approved plan developments from other communities that we're aware of off their website, so I can put those in another packet for more info for you. Just if you want to take a look to say, what does it actually look like? What would we be reviewing if town meeting was going to vote on one of these? Yep.
I think making sure that they're sized appropriate to the lots that we have would be
Sure.
more, would be helpful.
Yes, I agree. So moving through all that, the next 2 things we have, and I think that the last 2 things to talk about, were inclusionary housing and civic space. So Inclusionary housing, currently we do have, I believe it's called a multifamily affordability provision in the current bylaw. We do have one. We introduced a different scheme to the downtown zoning in 2020. Since then, the Affordable Housing Trust has asked us to recalibrate, I'll call it their multifamily housing affordability bylaw. They'd like us to tweak it, make it similar to what we have downtown. We said, okay, we can take a look at that. It wasn't too difficult in that we're more or less just recalibrating it to have one system. So whether you're downtown or anywhere else in town, the affordable housing component would be the same. And it's really 10% required for the smaller projects, 12.5% for the larger projects. And then there's some cash payments if it's fractional. So if you don't tip over to owe a whole unit, where currently you would actually need to provide an affordable unit, you can provide cash as a fractional payment for that.
And this had the caveat that we talked about last year, where that first 1 to a 2 is exempt. So this would kick in for those, more typical commercial style developments.
Yeah, it's the same formula as the one we did for February 2020.
Yep.
And then that's it for that one. The last item is civic space, and I'll turn it over to Aaron for that.
I get to talk about this one. We've had some input on this one, so let me kind of give this, and then I'll tell you kind of some of the preliminary feedback that we've received. But basically, the civic space zoning is based on this concept that your zoning map is your future land use map. Like at some point in the future, ultimately, all of the property on the map will be developed consistent with your zoning map. So when you look at the Danvers zoning map in that way, you will see that there's not a single square foot of space devoted to open space, devoted to schools, devoted to other civic spaces that kind of undoubtedly contribute to the character of the town. As we dove into this exercise, a secondary thing, and we started this conversation last year, as we've continued to refine this proposal, a secondary issue cropped up, which was we had problems with existing zoning boundaries, split parcels, and when you started to look at it, really zoom in and look at it, some of those district boundary lines didn't make a whole lot of sense. So we started to also kind of try to simplify and rectify some of those discrepancies that happened when you started to zoom in on the map. So let me give you the picture, and then I'll give you some of the caveats based on the feedback that we've heard thus far. So here's the existing zoning map. As I said, there's really no call out for all of the parks and open spaces and green spaces that we have throughout town. Moving ahead, the proposal creates 3 flavors of civic space: utilities and rights of way, institutional uses, schools, education, certain facilities associated with that kind of a use, and then open spaces. So you see, if I flip back and forth, and all the zoning, I should say, all of the colors are the same. I mean, these are the same map, just added with the green. There's quite a bit of square footage here in town that would fall into one of these categories. I will also say, interestingly, we have a copy of the 46 zoning bylaw map hanging in the planning office. You had institutional zoning back then. So Beverly Airport's on that map. A number of the local cemeteries are on that map. State Hospital. Somewhere between 46 and 68, I think, which is the next map we have hanging, it went away. So in a weird way, we're kind of bringing, like, all things old become hip and cool again. So this proposal kind of is a retro proposal. I will say, I just want to make sure, I want to make sure that was the last slide. The feedback we have received on this proposal since the conversations have started, there is one type of land that we've included in this proposal that we're getting significant pushback on. Totally reasonable to do, and that's again why we're putting it out there for discussion, is privately owned institutional properties, specifically churches and schools that are privately owned. Several planning board members have told us they're fairly uncomfortable with that. We weren't surprised by that, but again, as David said, we try to draft our articles and our scope wide and then refine through process and discussion. So I will tell you, we're prepared to wave the white flag, and when we return to the planning board on October 12th to resume our public conversations, we will be reporting back to them that we have had significant pushback on those privately owned parcels. We provided them with a list of that. I don't have a map subtracting those yet, but that's something we plan on providing the planning board by the 12th. But again, I just wanted you to know that that proposal seems to be a bit too rich for people at this point. But we hope to be able to continue to move forward with federal, state, regional properties and local properties going into some version of either a utility district, an institutional district, or an open space district.
What? Before the questions, because I know there are probably a lot, as a recent, for example, so, a recent development of a privately owned institutional parcel that people will all be familiar with is the Whipple Hill subdivision.
Is what?
Whipple Hill. So the subdivision of Whipple Hill, it was owned by the church.
Yeah.
It was sold, it was zoned as a residential property. It was sold on the open market. It was developed into homes. Had the map that you guys are displaying right now been in place 10 years ago, can you describe what that process would have been when the property owner decided they wanted to dispose of that property?
So in that case, all of the properties that are privately owned that we put in this district have a state law exemption from local zoning. So if the church wants to sell, if the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Boston wants to sell to the Unitarians, no problem. They could do that because the new buyer of that property enjoys the same protections under state law as the current owner. In the case of Whipple Hill, the Archdiocese wants to sell to a private developer who intends to utilize the community zoning for single-family homes. Sure. In that particular case, had this map been in play, the Archdiocese, or more likely the developer who had some sort of purchase and sale agreement, would have had to approach the town and say, we're buying the back half of this cemetery that the church no longer feels they need, and we feel it is appropriate to attach that back to R1 or R2, I think it might have been R2 over there, but, and come to town meeting and say that we'd like to put it back. The yield of this site is going to be 19. Are you okay with this proposal? Mm-hmm. As we've said, the feedback that we've received thus far from individuals of the planning board, individuals of the select board, has been, I'm a little wary of that. That feels a little, people are a little squeamish about it, and that's perfectly acceptable. But just wanted you to know that's a great case of.
And I think
versus what happened, which was they bought the land and just had to make it conform.
By right.
By right,
Because we
just
had
conform
already
to,
zoned
right,
it
because
for that use.
this is R2 or R whatever, and
Yep.
these are our parcel cuts, and this is how we're doing it here.
Now,
Yeah.
again, at that size, 19 homes, not the end of the world, we can absorb that. But I think there are some properties around town where, is the town prepared for something that could be significantly larger than that? Because right now, we've already telegraphed to the world, we want that to be a neighborhood of single-family homes. I'll pick on Plains
Or
Park.
can I just, or we haven't telegraphed to the world. I think there's an assumption that a property that looks a certain way and has for 100 years is never going to change, and people are often quite surprised to find out that that open space parcel is actually zoned for residential one and can become homes like that.
Right.
And I think, I want to put a fine, because this is controversial, I want to put a fine point on it before we move on, which is, in the scenario we just talked about, the town meeting may have said, no, we don't want to see single-family homes on the back half of that cemetery. So town meeting is, this change has an economic impact on the property owners. The flip side of that is we will quite often make zoning changes as a town meeting that add exponential value to people's properties. It's unusual to be proposing zoning that would potentially impact the opposite direction of somebody's property values. But this is a sticky problem, there's no right answer. The Commonwealth gives town meetings the authority to determine the future use patterns within their community. And it's, to the point Aaron was making, it's a conversation we're starting, recognizing that there are going to be a lot of strong feelings about it. But this is the map of our town as it's currently laid out today. The green is currently used as either open space or civic space. So,
And I think
Is
one of
there
the, I'm sorry, go
Oh,
ahead.
you said you didn't have a list, a way to show the parcels, that map split between private.
Correct.
and
I mean, I hope to have that
Yep,
by
okay.
Tuesday night for the planning board. Again, we're not sure the Tuesday night, the planning board's gonna have a chance to talk about it in depth, but at least, the goal is to have, that available for them.
So is the proposal, from your standpoint, to remove any of the privately owned properties from
think-
this particular?
Yeah, I think based on the feedback.
is that our proposal, or is that based
Well-
on, I want to be clear, this is,
Yeah,
the
Well, I
boards
mean, well,
make
yeah,
this decision.
yeah,
The
yeah.
planning board, the select board,
Yeah.
the finance committee are going to tell us what they think. Staff's not proposing.
No,
one
what,
way or
what,
the other, right?
what, I'm thinking, what are we gonna get to? What
Yeah.
what do you foresee being proposed ultimately to us at the final point
Right.
for an up or down vote, for a recommendation to town meeting, for what town meeting will then ultimately approve?
I think
So-
ultimately, the final proposal will look like federal, state, and town-owned land, and then the utilities associated with that, and that's probably about it.
So what, when we talk about federal, state, and town-owned land, what about what I would describe, which there are some quasi-public entities, like, for example, Beverly Airport? Are we, because I, you know, again, I understand the concerns that private folks had, and I more or less support what their argument was in regards to that. However, those quasi-public entities, like Beverly Airport, like the Beverly Salem Water District, I'm trying to think, there's probably a handful of other ones that are out there that have fairly sizable parcels of property in town. I don't see it the same for them.
right.
And so, you know, I would be in favor of keeping them in this particular, if we're gonna put these limitations on the town and on the state and on the feds, I would have no problem also putting it on, but I guess the question is how would we do that? If, you know, how can we legally differentiate between a St. John's Prep, which is a private entity but is also a not-for-profit entity, and Beverly Airport, which is sort of a quasi-public entity?
They're public. I mean, I think that, for me, I
Yeah.
categorize those as public.
Yeah.
Public service corporations. The airport is owned and managed by the city of Beverly. It's
Okay, so they are owned by,
it's
yeah, so,
municipally
yeah,
owned.
no, so those,
It's just
yeah,
not owned by us,
Yeah.
but it's in our corporate limits.
yeah,
Regional water supply, regional sewer supply, those are all,
yeah.
again, government entities. They're just not local they're not local municipal corporations, but they are derivatives of the state. So I would include that again, I think at this point, the feedback has been very specifically, generally speaking, about the education and religious institutions that are privately owned in town.
Well, I'm assuming also the hospital-based ones as well. We've got other,
I don't,
I mean, we've got to have some of those nonprofits that are, I mean, I'm thinking of, I mean, and this always gets into an issue for me, which is the ridiculousness of our law that allows certain entities to contemplate themselves as nonprofit,
Yeah.
when they have for-profit and nonprofit
Yeah.
components of their operation. But,
Leahy would not be included in this proposal because in this scheme here, Leahy is in the Hawthorne West district, so, it didn't get parceled out,
Yeah.
in this cut. The healthcare district that was the former Hunt Hospital is untouched in this
Okay.
scenario.
Mass General,
Mass General is untouched in this scenario. Again, they're nonprofit, but they're not,
yeah.
they didn't fall into that kind of, into this analysis.
I'm guessing a lot of the nursing rehab facilities are probably, as crazy as it sounds, many of them are probably nonprofit
Right.
as well.
In this scenario,
But this-
they're coming out. They come out. So
Okay.
on Liberty, I'm gonna say, is it Liberty Street, that Riverside Elementary is on? There's a hospice there
Yeah.
and there's a
Yes.
nursing home there. Those would come out, those would go back into the zoning district that they're in today.
Regularly, okay.
Because this is civic use, this is city, town, city.
Well, the original
Town,
proposal
state.
was for all those to be in it.
What were you
Again, I
gonna say?
think that, again, if you think of civic as broadly defined, not capital C, but lowercase c, again, like what, again, this idea started in my brain back in 2003 when I was the planning director for the town of Milton. And, what parish did you grow up in? You know what I mean? It was
Yeah.
like, I'm St. Brendan's. I mean,
Yeah.
it defined a lot of what you thought about the town and what church you went to. And just thinking about the importance of some of these institutions that aren't necessarily municipal in nature, but they absolutely shaped what you thought of your community and how you described your identity. And that our zoning maps generally don't reflect that when you look at, well, what are we as a community? I would say generally, this idea has been gaining some steam, and one of the boards, and I haven't had a chance to do it yet, but like plan development, we're not in that first wave of early adopters where this is like, still, is this an okay idea? I wouldn't say it's widespread, but it's not, legally, these have been tested and proved, acceptable. And you're seeing more and more communities say, wait a minute, we do need some protections from some of these uses. You like to think these sorts of institutions don't go away, but sadly, they do.
They do, yeah. Although I'd be more inclined, and I guess it seems as though it's a moot point. I would, as somebody who lives downtown, and there are a number of nonprofit properties in the downtown area, whether they be on the residential end or the commercial end. I would be much more comfortable with them reverting to their zoning and getting rid of them than the potential for something coming in that could go in by right. I would rather see, I'm trying to think of an example. Well, I'll use the hospice house on Liberty Street as an example, because it's unlikely that's going anywhere soon. That, to me, would be a pretty little cul-de-sac, and it reverting back to a institutional living facility, which is what it was before, to me is something that, and not a very good one, is something I wouldn't want in that neighborhood.
And this
So-
speaks to a little bit of how we crafted the articles in general, and I think, we try to craft them broadly, and to what you're talking about, we've batted it around, like, should we have said anything larger than 2 acres, anything, but then that's staff trying to really divine
That
something
gets
that we
tricky,
don't
yeah.
think was appropriate for us to try to figure out.
Right.
And, so again, we just said, well, if we're gonna do it, let's put the proposal on the table, they're all in. That's, well, I don't believe there's spot zoning in Massachusetts anymore, thanks to a couple of key SJC cases. Nonetheless, you start getting into, well, how did you make that cut? And I think that's something that we would need some feedback from the elected and appointed officials to give us that guidance. And, but I think at this point, that guidance has been, I don't care if it's 1 square foot or 100 acres, I think the privately owned thing, it seemed to touch a nerve. And we are likely to recommend the planning board maybe drop that element of this proposal.
What's enabled under the utilities and right-of-way?
Utilities and rights of way. It really, in this map, and it's a little hard to see, because we show it in
Right,
gray.
but I guess so what I'm saying is there are two different things. Rights of way can be patches of grass, utilities can be substantially different than patches of grass, and there's one particular patch of grass on Dayton Street that I have in mind when I'm asking that question.
In this particular case, there might be a cul-de-sac off of Dayton Street that would stay in the right-of-way, but the right-of-way doesn't preclude patches of grass.
I'm asking about the thing the state came last year on.
You're asking about what?
It looks like that,
oh,
it looks like that little
that's
circle zoned, it would now have a zone, some sort of zoning as
Yeah.
utility and right of
Yep,
way.
in this proposal, it is technically
It
part
would, yeah.
of the right-of-way, so it would now be zoned right-of-way.
Be civic
and
zoned.
any disposition of that parcel, or any attempt to cut that off from the right-of-way and do something else with the property would likely require a town meeting authorization.
So, I guess-
With the caveat that there are uses out there that don't need local zoning, because maybe they sell to a church, or they sell to something that doesn't need local zoning, and they can
Right.
go forward.
So I guess that's my question, if it's a right of way, what can you flip it to with this?
Something that's either right
Can all,
away or
can they
exempt.
drop a bunch of
Yeah,
electric
right.
transformers?
Otherwise
They-
exempt.
Yeah, otherwise exempt. Or they should, which I think they did last year and which was appropriate, come to town meeting and say, we've got 2 acres of surplus property and we want to put it in a more appropriate zone. Maybe they'd use the planned development district and tell us all about it.
I mean, you know, when you do the title work that I do, you would be shocked at how many properties that ultimately these came out of old YMCA camps or out of this particular church or I mean, it's a lot of fairly significant, and we've got a few in Danvers, but I think this makes perfect sense to take, at least at this point, start slow with this, and maybe it becomes something that makes more sense and builds up some more steam with certain other private uses.
What does the town gain as a landholder from doing this?
You meaning for the properties that we own, that we put into this zoning district? I don't think we gain anything. I think, again, it's just a reflection that these.
And if we wanted to sell those properties, that would have to go before town meeting anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think
Okay.
for us, it's just an acknowledgement
That's what I was
that
gonna say.
Plains Park contributes mightily to the social character
Yep.
of the town, Endicott Park, and we want our zoning map, our future land use map to reflect that. So it's kind of an inspirational or visionary statement to some extent, because it's semantic. We can, doesn't matter what it's zoned as long as we own it.
Okay.
So,
Everything's on the website for anybody who wants to go take a look.
Well, thank you. I thought it was really helpful in one of the memos that you sent that gave the categories. This is the memo from September 2nd that had consistency with state and case law, a couple of articles. Chronic problems, abutter issues, and nuisance, that set of articles. Highly desirable internal consistency, technical corrections section. I mean, it really helped helped me kind of start to think about what the presentation was probably going to be and how to respond to it. I thought that was a really helpful breakdown. And also stuff that was supposed to be done last year that couldn't because of COVID.
Yeah.
But I think that's a really helpful breakdown of the issues being discussed as well. This is stuff that we talked about last year, and here's a few new things.
great.
So I just think it was a really helpful breakdown.
And again, any questions, we're here, we're available. Ideally, we're trying to, again, from a process standpoint, we'd love to have all of the substantive comments, concerns in hand by the close of the public hearings at the planning board, which we're hoping to be 10/12, due to a number of development items that are now had to be put on that agenda. We might not, the board, depending on how late they want to go that night, might not be able to wrap up. We suspect they're going to say, we're tired, it's 10 o'clock, we'll deal with this in 2 weeks. So that's kind of had some downstream effects, but we'd love to have all of the substantive comments in hand by the close of the hearing so that we can incorporate that, and the planning board will know what that feedback was and incorporate that into their final position on these articles.
Now, you haven't limited that to just people that live in the town, have you? There's people that don't live in this town that are feeding you ideas or information with concerns
That's a point.
as to how these bylaws are going to be affected with these zoning changes.
We have not limited our input mechanisms or feedback loops. No,
Because I
that's,
understand you have an outsider that's going to already be at your television meeting next week, next Tuesday.
you are correct, yes. A particular local land use attorney.
Oh, the petition from the landowner petition, you're talking about?
That's one thing, yeah. Then the other one
Just
is,
the feedback in
he's
general.
going to all offer their opinions about some of the changes that we've
Well,
just
they are
discussed.
public meetings, and all members of the public are free to provide us input, and we do have some regular users here in town that are probably going to want to chime in on some of these proposals as well.
But they will have to state their name and affiliation for the record, just as anyone else would. So
Yep.
whether if you live on Wenham Street or are an attorney from outside of town, you have to make that clear when you provide your comment. But we do, that was one of the holdover items from last fall that you're referencing, which were the petition to rezone several properties on Maple Street. The attorney representing those properties will speak to that. We also, in addition to the zoning, will have our typical agenda item for unpaid bills. We'll have a few budget transfers. We'll be accepting some state funds to go into the senior transportation fund. And one of the select board members noted at the meeting this week, last week, this week, I've lost complete track of time, my brain's out,
Tuesday.
that there is a citizen's petition related to the train station. That this was an item that was discussed by the select board several meetings ago, and the select board declined to prepare an item for a town meeting for it. But it sounds like citizens have signed a petition, and there are, as we understand, enough signatures, so that'll also be coming back before this board, if it's delivered prior to the deadline for discussion on the 4th. Those, of course, go to town meeting regardless of the recommendations attached to them. But that may also be out there for our discussion on the 4th.
Really
Rodney waited all night just for those three things.
Rodney, thank you for being here. We appreciate your contribution.
But really, again, thank you for the time. We know
This was very
it's
helpful.
not it's a little out of the norm to have an earlier conversation with you, but we really thought, given the volume, it was critical to get the substantive comments early, and we really appreciate the time you gave us tonight.
And if you think of things that, don't hesitate to contact any of us, preferably David, but any of us. Questions about this stuff.
I mean, it's always unique because in most communities, the finance committee has nothing to do with zoning amendments to the town meeting. So it was very nice to include us in that and to get our input first.
Sure.
It probably is very helpful, I would say, to you guys as well, because
wicked.
Absolutely.
yeah,
Very
the last thing you want to do is get hit 2 weeks
Yeah.
before town meeting with, I don't think, no.
Yeah.
Exactly, yeah, we'd like to avoid any having to deal with
Yeah.
anything on the floor of town meeting, so much appreciated.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone.